fire fitting, flash window. Some camps had portable sawmills delivered so they could saw their own boards. Shanties during the late 19th century often still had log walls, but were built with board roofs, sometimes covered with tar paper for added waterproofing. Some camps, bunkhouses, and cook shanties were built close enough to each other that roofs could be built to cover the space in between. This was known as a dingle, and these camps were referred to as dingle camps. The space was often used for storage. Some camps built after 1900 were usually built entirely out of lumber, sometimes covered with tar paper. I believe this one was FE in 1937. Bunkhouses had one or more metal stoves in the center of the room with rows of bunks along the walls. Bunks were made of logs or boards with straw and blankets for bedding. Later, steel bunks and mattresses were used. Most lumbermen didn't like mattresses because they got dirty quickly and were hard to clean. However, they did like the steel frames because bugs couldn't burrow into them. Bunkhouses almost always had benches for the people to sit on, and lumbermen called them deacon seats. You can see those along the edges, bottom edges of the bunks. Bunkhouses usually had containers of water for washing, which are usually placed on top of the stove, like you can see there. They only had one large communal towel. This was a common scene in bunkhouses, men drying their clothes over the stove. This was a nightly occurrence. Bunkhouses usually had wooden racks or wires above the stoves to hang wet clothing on. And when that space was taken up, they would hang it from the rafters or any available space they could find. I'm not going to talk too much about life in the camps, because that would take up an entire hour just in itself. I go into more detail on that subject in my books, so if you're interested in that, learning more, look there. I did want to mention briefly the subject of music. One of our special guest, Ryan Miller, was before me after this. Music was very important in logging camps. It was one of the few forms of entertainment, the other being cards and reading. The lumbermen who could sing and play instruments were highly valued in camps. Many lumbermen were immigrants and played music and sang traditional songs from their homelands. Some lumbermen also wrote their own songs, often with logging themes. Camps sometimes had dances on Saturday nights with music. The men in one camp in Wisconsin in 1904 were penalized if they didn't contribute to the entertainment. One of the lumbermen wrote, quote, "Each one had to contribute their part. He must sing a song, tell a story, or whistle. If he could not do any of these, he must put a pound of tobacco in a 4-box. 1 pound is good for 1 month, but he must put in another." Cook shanties, everybody's favorite subject. When camps kitchens moved into their own shanties, they had room for proper kitchens and tables and sinks and ovens. A large part of each cook shanty was set aside for a dining room with long tables and benches. Yes, women were frequently seen in logging camps, often as cooks and cooks' assistants. They're often camp foremans, a family member of camp foreman, or one of the other cooks. And I especially like the giant loaves of bread. Here's a great photo of a cook shanty before the rush of the meal. You see a young lad sitting in the far end of the table. Camp bosses and cooks sometimes brought their families with them and lived and worked in the camps. Children often worked in the kitchens or in the barns. And I see on the walls hanging different various types of paper on the wall. This is decoration. These were usually containers that the food and things came in, magazine ads and magazine covers. Here's a more busy picture of a meal in progress. Lumbermen got 3 meals a day. They could usually eat as much as they wanted. Breakfast and dinner were served at the cook shanty. Cooks usually wanted the lumbermen in and out as fast as possible, so talking was usually forbidden. They often had signs in the cookhouses that say no talking. Talking was forbidden to prevent anyone from complaining about the food. And as mentioned, get people in and out as fast as possible. And one source suggested that, or said that meals usually only lasted 15 minutes. Camp food was usually pretty good, so I don't know how much complaining there was. Those who broke cook shanty rules were punished by having to wash dishes or cut firewood. Lunch was typically served in the woods and was delivered by sled, which you can see in the top photo. But food was usually cold by the time they got it, so fires were built to reheat it for making tea. I've also seen reports of people's being so cold that people's forks and spoons would stick to their tongues. So they always suggest to blow on it before. Again, I could do a whole talk just on food and logging camps, so I'm not going to go into it too much here. But I have a whole chapter of it on my book. Every camp had one or more stables for housing the oxen and horses that served as draft animals. Draft animals were crucial to logging operations. So lumbermen took great care of their animals. It's important that stables were well built with good ventilation, which let the moisture and fumes out, and they were cleaned regularly and the straw regularly changed. Stables usually had hardwood floors, which couldn't always be set for the bunkhouses. This was to protect the animals' hooves from the cold, damp ground. Harnesses and ox yokes were also stored there, as well as feed and hay, unless there was a separate hay barn. Most camps had a forge for repairing tools. Many had full blacksmith shops, like the one shown here. Blacksmiths repaired axes and chains. They sometimes made metal parts for sleds. They often did woodworking as well, such as building sleds, making axes and cantook handles. But some camps had carpenters specifically for that job. Blacksmiths also shod horses and oxen. Animals usually came into camps with shoes already attached, but they were often fitted with cocked shoes in logging camps. These were shoes with metal bars or spikes at the bottom that kept them from slipping on the ice. Oxen were the hardest to shoe, as their hooves were split into two parts. Oxen also had trouble balancing, so blacksmiths would build wooden frames with leather straps used to support their weight while they attached the shoes. You can see there's a bottom right. Some camps had filers whose job was just to sharpen dull saw blades. They'd sometimes have portable stands so they could bring them out into the woods and sharpen on site. Some camps had offices for the foremen to live and work in. Some had stores where the lumbermen could buy goods they needed for the winter, such as warm clothes, boots. They also sold some luxury items like tobacco and playing cards. Many also sold medicines like painkillers, cold remedies, and various cure-all elixirs that were mostly just alcohol, so they were pretty popular. Small camp stores might be incorporated into the office or a cook shanty. Some, like this one, that were built, had their own shanties built specifically in stores. You can see in the top left, just a big pile of rubber boots. Sales were usually deducted from the men's pay. Some camp foremen would advance money to lumbermen to spend on various merchants and photographers that would visit logging camps. That's why you see so many photographs, old photographs of logging camps, because photographers would travel to camps and charge men to have their pictures taken. Lumbermen would also make charitable donations to the missionaries that visited, and they also bought hospital tickets, which were traveling hospital agents. These were sort of a health insurance where you subscribe at a certain rate every month. If you were hurt or injured, you could go to the nearest hospital and have all your expenses paid. Final evolution of the logging camp is called the car camp. These were special train cars built as traveling camps. They had cars built as bunkhouses, kitchens, stables, blacksmith shops. Sometimes they'd have electric cars set up as electric power plants to power them. You notice they're quite a bit wider than a typical rail car. Besides building camps, lumbermen made miles and miles of logging roads and tote roads. Tote roads led from camps to the nearest town or to the nearest rail track or highway leading to the nearest town. These were usually built in the summertime or fall. Tote roads were used to bring food, hay, and other supplies to the camps. Lumbermen who were responsible for this, transporting, delivering the goods of tote roads were known as tote men. Sometimes the nearest town was 1 or more days away by sled or wagon, so small bunkhouses were built on tote roads for them to sleep in. In some cases, lumbermen would stay at farms along the way, which would provide extra income for the farmers. They would provide them with food, alcohol sometimes. The top sled here is filled with sacks of feed. The bottom one is a couple of hay bales. Animal feed is a premium out in the woods. Logging roads crisscross the woods, so sleds could be used to haul logs to the nearest waterway or rail line that would be eventually be used to transport them to the mill. The roads were cleared with trees and brush leveled where needed. Once they had accumulated about 8 inches of snow, they were ready to use. At that point, they were referred to as snow roads. Large camps, entire crews of lumbermen were dedicated to maintaining roads, plowing them, filling them in bare spots, keeping them clear of bark and other debris. Here you can see a lumber crew using a primitive snowplow made out of logs. Snow roads were eventually evolved into ice roads. These roads were covered with ice by sprinkling them with water from horse-drawn sprinklers, like one shown here. Sprinklers had large wooden tanks filled with water that is a rotating sprinkling device in the back that spread it over the roads. Tanks usually had metal buckets built into them, in which fires were built to keep the water from freezing prematurely. Here you can see a sprinkler being filled with water from a hole in the frozen ice river. And you can see a giant barrel connected to a rope attached to a team of horses that he used for dropping it into the hole and using the horses to draw it up into the water tank. Lumbermen would also cut ruts into the ice roads for the sleigh runners to fit into. This kept the sleighs from slipping off the roads. Ruts were either cut with axes by hand or with special sleds called rudders that had steel blades built into them for cutting into the ice. The ice roads were expensive to build and maintain, so they were cost prohibitive for most small operations. Some camps only utilized ice roads for main logging roads and used snow roads for branch roads. Now we get into actual work of felling trees. A lot of decisions had to be made before a single axe was even swung. Lumbermen had to decide which trees to cut. They had to decide where on the tree to make the cut. They had to decide which direction the tree should fall. Lumbermen wanted tall and straight trees with few defects. The bark at the bottom of the trees is very thick, quick dull blades. So the lumbermen had to choose a spot on the tree to make their cut that wasn't too low, so they didn't dull the blades too fast. But they didn't want to make it too high and waste valuable wood. Finally, they had to decide which way the tree should fall. Ideally, they would fell a tree in the direction of the logging road, so they had to make hauling it out easier. But they also need to try to avoid hitting other trees on the way down so they didn't get caught. Rather than leaving these decisions to the tree cutters themselves, some companies had hired specialists known as undercutters to do it for them. They examined each tree and cut notches in the bark that showed which trees to cut. And the location of the notch would indicate where on the tree to make the cut and which direction it should fall. All this helped the lumbermen, the cutters, save time, valuable wood. Axes were primarily used to cut down trees up through the 1850s. Early crosscut saws were expensive, heavy, and were relatively short, so they weren't practical for felling trees. Axes also had disadvantages. Swinging them quickly tired the lumbermen. Between 10 and 20 board feet of valuable wood had to be removed to fell a tree with an axe. Axe handles also only lasted about 3 weeks, and axe heads needed repairing or replacing after about a month of use. More advanced cross-cut saws were developed during the mid-19th century. These were longer and lighter, more flexible. So that trees could be cut down faster and cleaner. They didn't tire out the bend quite as fast. They almost universally replaced axes by the 1880s. Afterwards, axes were only used for trees that were too wide for crosscut saws. You can see they're cutting on the opposite side of the notch of the undercutter today. Cutting that notch also keeps the trees from splintering too much. Once a tree was on the ground, lumbermen known as swampers removed the limbs using axes and saws. Swampers also cleared a path through the woods so that oxen and horses could haul the trunk away. They also measured and cut the trunks into 12, 14, and 16-foot lengths. They also collected the wood debris known as slash and gathered it into piles so it could later be burned. This was a way, so it didn't become a fire hazard during the dry summer months. Swampers also cut the company mark into the bark of each log. The marks helped identify the owner of each log in case they got mixed up with logs of other companies on their way to the mill. These marks were known as bark marks or side marks. They were cut using axes, so they were usually pretty primitive. It's amazing how many survived. Once the logs were cut, they were hauled to the nearest river or lake or rail line that would eventually be used to haul them or transport them to the mill. The simplest way this was done was to roll the logs onto a small sled known as a go devil, which was pulled by an oxen or a horse. Another method was to use snaking tongs, but kind of like ice creepers used to carry blocks of ice a long time ago. The ends were stuck into the trunk of the log and then attached by a chain to a horse or oxen. Oxen were originally used to haul logs because they were more readily available in the upper Midwest during the early days of the logging industry. They were stronger, sturdier than horses, or more readily available at the time. In the 1870s, larger horse breeds like the Percherons, Belgians, and Clydesdales were introduced to the upper Midwest. Horses were faster than oxen, and the larger breeds were almost as strong. They started quickly replacing oxen, and horses were almost exclusively used by 1900. Horses continued to be used long after steam and gas-powered tractors were introduced. I believe the horses here are Percherons. You can see how big they are. On long and extensive logging roads, logs were usually piled along the sides of the roads at clearings known as skidways. They would eventually be loaded onto sleds and transported to rivers or rail lines that would take them to the mills. While at the skidway, a lumberman known as a scaler would measure the logs and estimate the number of board feet of wood they would produce. A board foot was 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 inch of lumber. Below there, you can see a scaling rule. Scalers would also mark the end of each log with a company mark using a marking hammer. Symbols were often different than the symbols used for the bark marks. Since they were made cast through forged metal hammers, they would be more elaborate. Companies usually change their marks from year to year as a way of keeping track of logs harvested from one year to another. Log marks were usually registered with county and state officials. And once a log was marked, it was considered legal property of the company. In Minnesota, log marks were registered with the Surveyor General. The Historical Society has the original, Minnesota Historical Society has the original mark record book of the Surveyor General. It contains more than 20,000 marks. Wooden sleds were used to move the logs from the skidways to the rivers, lakes, and rail lines. Sleds consisted of 2 sets of runners, which were either connected to each other with a wooden beam like this one, or they were connected with chains. The chains allowed them to, the runners to be spaced apart to accommodate logs of different lengths. This is one of the rare photos of the sled without it. Sleds were usually constructed by the camp blacksmiths or carpenters, if there was one. They were made from locally procured wood, though some metal parts, occasionally oak planks for runners were brought in. Logs were loaded onto the sleds by rolling them on the logs with, using skids, which is where the term skid brake comes from. Lumbermen used cant hooks to roll the logs on, which are basically kind of like a device, but swiveling iron claw on it. See one back on top as one. This method using forces you can see here to bring the logs up the skids. This was known as cross hauling. It involved attaching one end of a chain to the sled, wrapping it around the log, and then attaching the other end to the draft animal. When they pulled, the logs dragged up the skid and onto the sled. The person you can see at the top, the cant hook, you position the log to any final position once it was on top. Size of the load depended on the size of the logs, the size of the sled, the size and health of the animals pulling it, and the distance they had to travel. It was up to the teamster who was in charge of the animals to determine how many logs they could pull. Logs were stacked on sleds in one of two ways. One was pyramid fashion, which was with a wide base, typically a single log at the top. This was known as a peaker. It was the simplest form because it was required the least amount of chains to bind it to the sled, but it also limited the number of logs that could be carried at one time. The other method was to stack them in a pile with perpendicular sides. This method required more chains to hold it together, but loads could be much larger. A lot of old logging photos, you see sleds with immense load of logs like this, sometimes being pulled by a single horse. Also show photographers who visit camps and charge lumbermen to take photos. This is usually a good opportunity for them to show off. Immense loads like this, these were usually too heavy to be pulled long distances. Tall loads were unstable and were likely to break the chains if the sled swayed or went off up or down a hill. The image you see here is the largest load ever hauled by a single team of horses. At a place in Michigan, the load weighed more than 100 tons.
Did the horses live?
Yeah, I think it did. The logs and sled were transported to Chicago by rail to be displayed at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, along with the entire logging camp. In reality, most logging loads probably look like this. When laying out logging roads, lumbermen tried to avoid hills whenever possible, but it wasn't always possible. So going up or down a hill, lumbermen would lay straw or sand down the roads to provide friction and help slow the sleds descend. When going uphill, they would use draft horses or draft animals to provide extra pulling power. Eventually, steam-powered winches. Later on, lumbermen used steam and gas-powered tractors. But they didn't completely replace draft animals until the second half of the 20th century. Before the introduction of trains, logs were brought to clearings along banks of rivers and lakes, and these were known as rollways. Logs were kept there until spring when the melting snow and rain would flood the water, and the horses or the logs would float and begin their journey to the mill. As many logs as possible were deposited right on the ice or on the frozen water. The rest were piled on the banks. Logs that the floodwaters didn't carry away in the spring had to be rolled by hand. Trains were used to deliver logs. They were stacked logs were stacked along rail tracks to send them waterways. Here's a great photo of a lake or wide river entirely covered with logs. But it was difficult to manage all these logs that drifting apart from each other. So in many cases, wide rivers and lakes, they would consolidate the logs into rafts to prevent them from scattering. Rafts were made by connecting a series of logs together with chains and ropes to create a ring enclosure. Then the ring was filled with remaining logs. And rafts were originally propelled by lumbermen with large oars, and later by steamboats. In many cases, the lumbermen just let the current carry the logs to the mill. Lumbermen, known as drivers, travel with the logs to keep them moving. They're often armed with long poles for pushing the logs, and also peavies, which is like a cant hook, except with a spike tip. Driving was the lumberman's most dangerous job. There was a constant threat of being crushed by logs, hypothermia, being constantly wet, and also drowning. And the ability to swim was not a prerequisite for being a driver. Because of the dangers involved in driving, the lumbermen had to volunteer for the job. Only the hardiest, most agile were chosen, and they're also the best paid lumbermen. Some drivers wore red sashes around their waists as symbols of their elite status as lumbermen. Drivers most famously depicted as riding logs wherever they go, but most of them traveled by boat, which was much safer. They also could carry their tools and personal gear in them. Lumbermen sometimes work from shore as well to keep the logs moving with long poles. Only when logs couldn't be reached by land or by boat did the drivers actually walk over them, ride them if needed. Drivers typically wore spiked boots to help keep them slipping when walking over the logs. And the lumbermen on the right are applying water repellent tools. Most drives had one or more rafts called wanigans. These had tents or wooden shacks built on them and served as floating kitchens and bunkhouses. Drivers always put ashore at night, as it was too dangerous to drive logs in the dark. So they either set up camps on shore or slept in the wanigan bunkhouses. Because of the energy drivers expended on log drives, they were allowed up to four or more meals a day. Breakfast and dinner were served on shore, but the rest were usually eaten on the go. Drivers either carried food with them or meals were delivered to them by one of the cooks, like you guys see here. Logs frequently got stuck on rocks or fallen trees, going around sharp bends and jams. Sometimes occurred. Actually, jams were quite common. Frequently jammed during the night when the men slept. Most were fairly easy to fix. Some were bad enough to cause flooding or force a river to change its course. One of the largest log jams occurred on the St. Croix River near Taylor's Falls in 1886, which is shown here. It contained an estimated 150 million board feet of timber. Waterways were frequently used by multiple logging companies. And this is why logs were stamped with their owner's mark. Logs frequently got intermixed with logs from other companies. It was very time consuming to sort them. So companies would sometimes band together and build sorting booms on rivers. Booms were made of interconnected logs or timber frames. They were formed into funnels that fed into sorting and storage areas. Once a log was sorted and consolidated, they were often made up into log rafts. Keep them from scattering again. And then they continued their journey to the mill. One of the first booming companies in the upper Midwest was the St. Croix Boom Company. Its sorting boom was built on the St. Croix right here in Stillwater in 1851. And this image shows a sorting boom on the St. Croix early 1912. I don't know if it's the same one. Over time, water transportation was abandoned in favor of trains and eventually logging trucks. This method is safer, more reliable, and the logs didn't require sorting. This is the result of all that hard work. And you can see the massive sided boards that can make the old road fine. Lumber, of course, was produced in sawmills. Some sawing methods evolved over time. Different types of saws were used. Water power gave way to steam. Many mills were small operations producing just enough lumber for local consumption. This one was located near Pine City, so doesn't have a roof over it yet. Some sawmill operations were massive operations owned by large corporations. The top image shows the Leech Lake Lumber Company in Walker, Minnesota in 1915. The bottom mill was located in Bemidji in 1920. This was the David Tozer Lumber Yard in South Stillwater, so 1912. Once the lumber was cut, it was sorted by type and quality. Lumber was sometimes made up into large rafts for transportation, similar to log rafts. This raft was on the Mississippi heading to St. Louis, circa 1869. You can see the raftsmen on the end, helping steer with the large oars. Lumber was also transported to ports on the Great Lakes, and they were loaded onto ships. From there, it could be transported through the Great Lakes and could eventually make its way through the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean. It could also be transported through the Erie Canal to the Hudson River, from there to New York City. And from New York City, transported on ocean-going freighters. Lumber was also transported throughout the country by rail. This one's trains heading west, where a lot of the Midwestern lumber was sent. Lumber dealers in major cities bought and accumulated lumber from all over for resale. This image shows the Chicago Lumber District in the 1870s. Lumber yards like this, it was transported by ship, rail, and later by truck throughout the United States. From ports along the Atlantic and Pacific coast, it was transported around the world. And that ends our historic journey in the woods of the world. I'd like to finish tonight with a few images that showcase the legacy of the logging industry in the upper Midwest. This image shows the Lumbermen's monument in the Huron-Madison State National Forest in Michigan. It reads, quote, "Erected to perpetuate the memory of the pioneer lumbermen of Michigan, through whose labor was made possible the development of prairie states." Both men and women compete in lumberjack competitions held throughout the country each year. The Lumberjack World Championship is held in Hayward, Wisconsin, each summer. This is a modern Lego themed Lego set that my son got as a gift a few years ago. I particularly like the beaver. Of course, you can't talk about the legacy of logging without Paul Bunyan, who's still a fixture of our society. This little golden book was published just in 2020. This is a picture I took last summer while I was going to the grocery store. And I'm going to close with the giant talking robot Paul Bunyan located brainer. It was built in 1965. It's 26 feet tall, sitting down. And wears a size 80 boot. I'd like to thank the Washington County Historical Society for having me here this evening. Also like to thank Ryan Gale for coming here and playing tonight. I hope you all stick around and listen to me. Copies of my new book, Shanty Boys, can be purchased here at the
front desk.
They're in the back. You can pay for it front desk. And we have a deal with Brian's CDs also.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm here for books.
Yeah, I'm just gonna I'll get the music stuff set up and we'll just take 5 minutes.
Sure.
Quick stretch break.
If I stand here, is that working?
What's that?
Is this okay if I'm
Oh, yeah.
outside kind of?
Absolutely. And
Yeah, I can.
let's see, do you have them on
I've got it here.
laptop or?
It's right there.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Wait.
So that's my computer. No problem. You get to go like that. Would you like me to take? Oh, it's great. Yeah, I might be able to.
I'll just, I can even just, I can over here.
Podium.
Oh, that's, well,
That's great.
Oh, yeah.
good, yeah.
You need that one, then?
So, yeah, so we're ready. So floor.
Really?
First.
Yeah.
200.
Trying to screw it over as far as possible. Sure, we're still good. I'm saying
I don't know, I mean, you roll one lumberjacks.
still good.
Is the Zoom thing working?
Yeah, it is.
Are some people tuned in?
Yeah, we've got some.
That's great. It's not a people here.
My dad worked in the mine.
It is,
You
yeah.
guys are very popular.
Good.
Four boys. Get a big place. Some place to live with boys. No, we was in Canada. Got the same
Some research on one of the last logging camps was in Stella Lake.
Do you need any?
Good.
Yeah, we.
So they're all part of one.
Mine's the cord right there. I don't want you to trip.
Straight.
Seven on Zoom.
What's much of the books are they go checked out?
Yes, yeah, they are entered into the system.
Some other guy was stressing me with gas.
Basically, we're just. So, okay. Yeah, they're all set to go in there.
But he does know now. This is fascinating.
Oh, I see. Yes. Show up here. It's right in the store. To show that they're not the industry in the same way that is with a gallery fashions in the 1860s. Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, wouldn't it ever give it a few more minutes?
Thank you again for the advice.
Oh, no, it's worked out great. Yeah.
Would you guys want to take your seats? I think we're going to get started. Not with me singing with them.
Go for it if you have a song.
No.
Otherwise, you have to put a tobacco in the tobacco box.
Exactly. We want people to stay.
Go ahead.
All right, guys, so we're gonna get started. So this is Ryan Miller, and he performs typically with a duo, but tonight we have him special by himself, so an extra treat for us. He performs with the Lost 40 duo, and he has lots of interesting themes in his music and some really interesting styles combined with the stories as well. So without further ado, Ryan Miller.
It's so tasty and I want to.
Find out my big booming voice is too loud for the amplification. But thanks so much. Thanks to the Heritage Center, for having me here, and thanks to my friend Ryan Gale for asking me to do it. I met Ryan like 25 years ago. Seems insane to say, but and it was because I got interested in Irish music when I was a teenager. I grew up in Bemidji, in the shadow of our iconic concrete Paul Bunyan. And I was a lumberjack in high school, was the mascot. We have the Paul Bunyan sub shop up there, Paul Bunyan Park, Paul Bunyan Drive. It's everywhere you look. And we have a logging festival every winter, Buena Vista Logging Days, north of town. So that was all going on. And I was uninterested as a kid. Well, I loved the woods, but I was into music. And then I got obsessed with Irish music. Where did that? So random. But I got interested in Irish music from going to the Winnipeg Folk Festival when I was a teenager, and it brought me on this path. That's how actually I met Ryan, performing with my Irish band. We used to play around northern Minnesota, and it seemed like that was a big departure from where I grew up, until I found that people used to sing songs in lumber camps, and that actually the songs that they sang had a lot of connections to Ireland. And this is because, I think people know there's a famous wave of Irish immigration in the mid 1800s due to the failure of the potato crop and other economic conditions in Ireland. Actually, going back even to the early part of the 1800s, right after the Napoleonic Wars, Irish people were coming over to North America, and the cheapest ticket in the early days was to Canada. And so Irish people ended up in New Brunswick and Quebec City. And what did you do for a job there if you were an impoverished immigrant fresh off the boat? Well, you went and worked in the woods. And so there are a lot of Irish that worked in the early logging industry. And then their sons followed those jobs to Minnesota. It's specifically the St. Croix Valley, that at one point the St. Croix Valley and Stillwater specifically was thought of as a Miramichi town. It was full of people from the Miramichi Valley of New Brunswick, largely an Irish area, and an area full of Irish immigrants anyway that followed those jobs to Minnesota. So I'm going to sing some songs, and like I said, I'm just thankful for Ryan for asking me and being interested in my Irish music, and now we have this common interest in lumberjack history. And I really recommend Ryan's book. It's very well researched, and he's really having immersed my own self in this research over the last 10, 12 years. I know he's saying the right stuff. He's dead on, and he's done great research and found beautiful photos. So this photo here, I didn't even plan this, but that's a photo that was taken by Stillwater's John Runk, if I'm not mistaken, or at least part of his collection at the Minnesota Historical Society. And it was taken at a camp on the Kettle River. So on the Minnesota side of the St. Croix Valley up toward Hinckley, that kind of direction. And I'll sing a song that was sung up there by a man named Michael Dean. And Michael Dean was one of these sons of Irish parents. His parents came to Canada, which is kind of the same story. They didn't go to the Miramichi. They went more Ottawa Valley area. They lived in a place called Smiths Falls, Ontario. And then they crossed over into northern New York. And that's where Mike was born in 1858. And he came to Minnesota in 1885 and settled in Hinckley first, where he quit being a lumberjack and started being a bartender because he could make more money that way, less hard work. But he had all these wonderful songs that he picked up when he was younger and working logging jobs in northern New York and Michigan and probably Minnesota. And there were songs that were sung, like Ryan said, the deacon seat at the base of the bunks in the evenings. And this is one that was based on an old Irish melody, or old kind of British Isles melody. And they put new words to it called A Shantyman's Life. So it's perfect for the book there. And it kind of just tells a year in the life of a shanty boy, a logger, and it mentions there being, unfortunately, very few women and very little booze in the camp. Well, the shantyman's life is a wearisome one, though some think it free from care. The swinging of an axe from morning until night in the forest wild and drear, and sleeping in a shanty bleak and cold, where the wintry winds do blow. As soon as the morning star does appear, to the wild woods we must go. Had we ale, wine, or beer, our spirits for to cheer, while we're in the woods so wild, or a glass of whiskey strong, while we're out there all alone, it would pass away the long exile, transported from the glass, separated from the lass. Our lives are long and drear, with no friend in sorrow high, to catch the rising sky, or to wipe away the grimy tear. When the spring does come in, our hardship then begins, for the waters fierce and cold, drip and wet will be our clothes, and our limbs they are half froze. Those pipe holes we scarce can hold, but rocks, shoals, and sands give employment to our hands. So our well-manned raft we steer, and the rapids that we run, well, they seem to us but fun, for we're void of all slavish care. Yes, a shantyman's life. Really someone, though some think it free from care, swinging of an axe from morning until night in the forest wild and rare. Thanks. I have a hard time stopping myself from talking too much when I do these performances because I find the history so fascinating. But Ryan gave me a little extra time, so I'm going to use it to tell a few more stories in between the songs. That one kind of has a cool story behind it because I was interested in this singer, Michael Dean, because there were some transcriptions of his singing that were made by sort of an eccentric English professor that worked at UND, Grand Forks, in the late 19-teens and used to hitchhike around the upper Midwest collecting songs from old timers. Kind of fascinating guy. Franz Rickety was his name. And there's a songbook and you can find some of Michael Dean's songs transcribed in there like sheet music. And so that fascinated me. And then I found out that Michael Dean had published his own very cheaply printed, flimsy little songster of 166 songs that are almost all kind of Irish related songs that he had learned throughout his life. Got really fascinated by that and did loads of research on him in the newspapers up at the Pine County Historical Society and at MNHS following his life around Hinckley. And then one day I found a newspaper article that mentioned that he was recorded and it was kind of a big treasure hunt. It turns out that it seemed like they were at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., but they didn't think that they had them. But then the collection that they were supposed to be in had a miscellaneous box in it, which every archive should have. And sure enough, they opened up the miscellaneous box and there were, I think by the end of it, it's like 50 recordings from Minnesota made in 1924. Some of the earliest like kind of archival music recordings from Minnesota. And it was quite a find, very exciting. And so that song I actually got to learn from actual audio recording made on a scratchy old wax cylinder.
Wow.
In 1924, Michael Dean. Amazing. The next one I didn't have quite as much luck with finding a recording. But here, I'll do another picture. And this photo here, yeah, this photo here is from up my neck of the woods, up by Bemidji, and see the dinner horn there. It's great shot. I know MNHS has this one, but I actually found my own special copy on eBay. I was excited, and it had a little arrow pointing up to say who the guys were, and there's a family that still lives in Bemidji. Pretty cool. Anyway, this song comes from not Bemidji, a little bit over the Grand Rapids area. There's a lake up there, Pokegama Lake, and this is kind of a goofy song to balance out the sad one. And it was written by a guy that's in the song, Frank Hasty. And there's a number of names in the song. And if you know kind of your Irish surnames, your Irish last names, you'll notice that a lot of the names are Irish names. So there were really quite a few Irish names around the logging industry in Minnesota, especially the early days. But this is kind of a joke song. Lumber camps, because of that need for entertainment, that need to pass the time. And they didn't even have iPhones. I mean, it's desperate. And they didn't have Wordle. How could they survive? But they also preserved a lot of folklore and jokes, and there was a lot of picking on the new guy and goofy remedies, things that were brought over from the old country. So this one kind of hints at that. They're talking about chasing this bear all around camp and trying to kill this bear, and it's just utter mayhem. And then at the end, there's some insinuation that if you render the fat from a bear, it'll cure baldness. So something to keep in mind. But it's called the Pokegama Bear, and I got it from a great folklorist, John Berquist, who was at one point was the state folklorist in Minnesota. I think he's from Evelyn originally. Great, fascinating guy.
We are students.
people that likes to have fun. Come listen a while and I'll sing you a song. Come listen a while and the truth I'll declare. While I sing all about the Pokegama Bear. Well, Morris O'Hearn was a bold Irish lad. He was building a fire in a pine stump. The dad, when the ring of his axe broke the cold morning air, and awakened the monster Pokegama Bear. With a roar like a lion, Martin he did swear, "Run, boys, for God's sake, for I found the bear." When out of the woods, young Jim Quinn he did cry, "Oh, shut up, O'Hearn, find your own porcupine." Then into the wild woods this Bruin he flew. O'Hearn and Frank Hasty did quickly pursue. Yes, into the wild woods our heroes did tear, to take dead or alive the Pokegama Bear. Well, the bear he went mad and had Hasty did steer. He braced for the impact without dread or fear, with his jaw firmly set and his axe in the air. He stumbled and fell on Pokegama Bear. Then back to the tote road this Bruin did go. He thought that was better than wading in snow, but little he knew what awaited him there. Cruel fate was against that Pokegama Bear. For bold Mike McAlpine, a man of renown, a noted foot racer on Canadian ground, he ran up the road with his axe in the air, and he dealt the death blow to Pokegama Bear. And the carcass was brought then back to our camp. Oops, I jumped ahead. Oh, then back to the scan. The Bruin was sent to clean him and dress him was our intent. And agreements were made that each man get his share of the grease that was in the Pokegama Bear. And the carcass was brought to our cook and his fryer. It was all very good, oh, there were no deniers. It tastes like roast chicken, Bill Monahan could swear, as he shoveled in great gulps of Pokegama Bear. Now my song is ended, I'm dropping my pen. But Morris O'Hearn, he still has that bear skin. Here's a health to you boys and long growth to your hair. For it's greased with the fat of Pokegama Bear. There you go. That's a great one. I like that. So here we go. We'll go to another picture. This is back down this way. This is over on the Wisconsin side of the St. Croix Valley, a camp near Slim Lake, which is, I think it's near Spooner. And spot the violin, and spot the fiddle, I should say, in the photo. It's what, like, I'm glad Ryan pointed out the fact that a lot of the photos that you see in logging camps have an element of being posed. I mean, you have to imagine, it was such a big event to have a photographer in the camp that you wanted to look cool for your girlfriend back home, of course. So you often see guys fake fighting. I can't remember if there's anybody fake fight. You'd see there's always two guys like this, and they got the guy, the one's giving another one a haircut in this, and the guys that like playing cards are playing cards, and the guy with the fiddle is playing the fiddle, and the people are standing on the roof looking super cool. And with that smoke, that's cool. Guy's got a sweet pipe out. Sometimes you'll see a guy that has a fancy watch and they got to hold up the watch. You know, everybody's trying to look cool. It's just like selfies, really. Social media of the day, slow motion social media. Anyway, I'll sing a song. This is a very local song, and I used to sing this one a lot, and then I didn't for a long time, and then now I'm here in Stillwater, so it has to be sung. And there was a timber cruiser named Ed Hart. So, and he was another one of these sons of Irish immigrants. He was from Windsor, Hants, I think is the name of the place. It's out in Nova Scotia, from Nova Scotia, and came to the Stillwater area very early. I think in the song he says the year 1853. So that was quite early on. He mentions knowing old man Greeley. And we just drove up the road, or I just drove up the road really to get in here, and really was it Ed? I can't remember what his first name was. Elam. Supposed to have the first sawmill, right? The first sawmill in Minnesota.
A sawmill.
He had a sawmill. Okay, we won't get into the minutia. But anyway, this guy Ed Hart was a real person. I've actually been in touch with some of his descendants. He married a Native American woman, I think possibly a Ho-Chunk woman over up in the Spooner area. And before that, he was a cruiser down around the St. Croix Valley. And the song was made up by, it's kind of a funny story, it was made up by an agent of the government that was sent here to bust illegal logging. So this agent came from Chicago, and he was supposed to be like the sheriff enforcing the law. And he met this old character, Ed Hart, and he was so charmed by him that he didn't bust him at all. He just hung out with him and thought he was so fantastic. He wrote a song about the guy. And he said Ed Hart could sleep out in the middle of the winter in just a sleeping bag in the snow, and he was just amazing. So anyway, this is a song that was made up by, the guy's name was William Young. He was an agent for the government, and he wrote up this song about romantic local character Ed Hart here in Stillwater. And it mentions a lot of people, a little funny local logging politics. Anyway, here we go. See if I remember it. Well, I'm from, and it says he's from Bangor, but that's very close to Nova Scotia, Bangor, Maine. Well, I'm from the town of Bangor, that's in the state of Maine. A native Irish American, I speak this language plain, and I landed in Stillwater town in 1853. My arm was strong, my heart was warm, my courage bold and free. So it's on the boom I served my time for corporation fare. Plenty to eat such as it was, and something I had to wear. So I worked the Namacoggin in old Schulenberg's employ, and the Clam and Yellow Rivers for the Valley and Bob Malloy. And I camped among the wigwams on to Togatick's green shore, where I held my own with Whalen, Jim Karate, and George Moore. And I worked with Pease and Jackman in the year of 74. And when old Dan, he shelled the peas, I heard those cannons roar. I have been at stopping places when traveling on my way, where graybacks, I think that's lice or fleas, graybacks big as June bugs were as thick as flowers in May. And I worked with old man Greeley up upon the St. Croix Drive, where mosquitoes big as hummingbirds would eat any man alive. And I might have been a partner with Ike Staples in his mill, or at least a boss for Lewis or old New Brunswick Bill. But I'm always weak with women, let them be wives or maids. the fair ones and the cruel ones, with hearts as black as spades. Well, they left me broke entirely, not 1 cent to my name. I can work for Dun and Cruddy, but it's always just the same. So I'm thinking I'll try farming and forget my younger days, make a homestead up in Bashaw, where I'm sure I'll mend my ways. There you go. Next, and so that whole thing there too, with the unaccompanied singing, like no guitar or anything like that, that's how they always did it in the camps. There wouldn't have been playing along if somebody was singing, and that's how they did it in Ireland up until the early part of the 20th century as well. So, and really a lot of places in the world, a song is a song and a dance tune is a dance tune. So if you're gonna play music for dancing, you play instruments, and if you're gonna sing, you just sing. And that's how it was in the log camps. And they, just like they do, it's still kind of a thing in Ireland to speak the last words like that. It sounds a little funny maybe to the American ear, but if you get into Irish traditional singing, that's kind of a convention that you speak the last few words of the song. And it's kind of a way of different people have different theories about it, but it's supposed to kind of convey that you were telling a story the whole time, that it's not all about your fancy noodly singing. It's about your, your story that you were telling. But they love the noodles too. This one is just over there in the gallery. I saw it. This is one of my absolute favorite and most dramatic logging photos from, I think it says over there in your display that it's from the Apple River. So another tributary of St. Croix. But it's guys trying to break what was probably not an enormous log jam, but a small log jam at the top of a waterfall. And this was one of the most incredibly dangerous things that you could end up trying to do. And if you can see the guy, he's hanging out over the precipice and the guy's holding him by his belt loop. And the one guy's way out at the tip. And of course, what's the goal of all these people? The goal is that those logs go over the waterfall. Like that's the goal. So
Hang on.
just incredibly dangerous and almost like a death wish kind of job if you were the one sent out to break the jam. So this is a song that was don't have a recording of this, but it was collected by that English professor Franz Rick. It was collected up in Bemidji, where I'm from, by a guy who I've since learned was also a wonderful fiddle player and won a fiddle contest down in Minneapolis in the late 20s. But in the early 20s, he'd retired from lumberjacking and he was a janitor up in Bemidji. I don't know where, but he was had all these wonderful old songs. And again, from a family that had come through Canada, Ottawa Valley. And this song he brought from his locality where he grew up near Lanark in Ottawa Valley. And there's a tributary of the Ottawa River, believe it or not, named the Mississippi River. Could have maybe, figured that out, choose a different name maybe. But then there's a Mississippi River in Ottawa that's a tributary of the Ottawa River. And there was a horrible log jam there. And the local lumberman sent out a young Irish guy named Jim Whalen to break the jam. And he went over and died. And this song was made up about that. So we'll do a sad one and I'll finish with a happy one. I'm going to sit down and do this. Be brave. Gentlemen and ladies, I pray you will draw near and not sudden most terrible, I soon will let you hear concerning our noble youth, Jim Whalen he was called. He was drowned off Pete McLaren's raft below the upper falls. Well, the rapids, they were raging fierce. The water was so high, says the foreman on to Whalen. This jam we'll have to try. You're young, you're brave and active. When danger's looking near, you're just the man to help us now. These waters to make clear. Whalen he made answer unto his comrades bold, saying, "Come on, boys, though it's dangerous, we'll do as we are told. We'll obey our orders manfully, as a young man they should do." As he spoke to Champion Road, and let poor Whalen through. While the foaming billows roar, tossing logs from shore to shore, now here, now there's body goes tumbling o'er and o'er. One awful cry for mercy, oh God, look out on me. His soul is freed from earthly bond, brought to eternity. So come all you jolly lads and think on poor Jimmy's fate. Be careful and take warning before it is too late. For death is lurking near you, ever eager to destroy. Pride beneath a father's heart, likewise a mother's joy. Great, so I'll finish up with one more. Thanks again. Thanks for coming to listen. Thanks to those that tuned in online. Anybody's doing that. And Ryan, Emily, and the Heritage Center here for having me. Isn't this a beautiful facility? It's really fantastic. And Stillwater's lucky to have it. We're all lucky to have it here in Minnesota. It's really a great place. And I love the exhibits. Great to be able to look around. So thanks for the tour. I'll finish up with a song that was printed in the Stillwater Messenger in, I'm not going to say the right year, something like 1930. There was sort of an awareness during the flapper era in the 20s. They're just like people maybe don't love the music of the Super Bowl. That people didn't love the music that the flappers were listening to in the 1920s, and they were disgusted with all this jazz and American popular music that was developing. And they were sick to their stomachs, and they wanted to get back to the stuff that I'm playing, these old lumberjack songs from the late 1800s. And so people were, looking for the old timers that had the old songs. We preserved the old songs. There were magazines that had columns, old songs that men have sung. And people were passed around, so trying to preserve these things, you know, and it's great. It's great that they did. So the Stillwater Messenger made a little small effort of their own, and they published a call for anybody that had old songs from the lumberjack days. And people sent songs into the paper. And this is one of the ones that was sent in. It's called the Shanty Boys Alphabet. I felt bad. Last time I saw Ryan, his son was there and he wanted to hear this song. And I couldn't remember how to do it. So I've since practiced it. Yeah, I've got 2 kids of my own, and you'd think I know the alphabet by now. But do stay if you want after, ask questions. Buy Ryan's book. I've got some CDs.
How you doing up for the night?
It's a beautiful picture there from the State Archives of interior of a bunkhouse in Hubbard County, I think, up north, near Park Rapids. So the chorus is, if you want to sing, you know, it's a good thing to do to kind of finish off the night. So merry, so merry, so merry are we. No mortal on earth is as happy as we. Sing hi-derry ho, derry, hi-derry down. Give a shanty boy grub and nothing goes wrong. So that's your part. If you choose to accept it, join in and bolster my confidence up here. Oh, A is for axes as well, you all know. We are the boys that can string them also. C is for chopping, first to begin. D is the danger we oft-times are in. E is the echo that through the woods rang, and he's the foreman, boss of our gang. G is the grindstone that swiftly did move, and H is the handle so slick and so smooth. So merry are we. So merry, so merry, so merry are we. Lovely, no mortal on earth is as happy. Hi-derry, ho-derry, sing hi-derry, ho-derry, hi-derry down. Shanty boy, grow up, shanty boy, grow up, and nothing goes wrong. There you go, now you're in the camp. I is the iron that marks all our pine. J is the jobber who's never on time. K is keen edges, our axe to keep. And L is the lice that keeps us from sleep. Well, M, it's the moss that we stuff in our camp. And N, the old needle to sew up our pants. O is the owl that hoots in the night. And P is the pine which we fall in daylight. So merry, so merry, so merry, so merry are we. No mortal on earth is as happy as we. Sing hi-derry, ho-derry, hi-derry down. Give a shanty boy grub, and nothing goes wrong. Woo. U, it's the quarreling we never allow. R is the river, our logs they do plow. S is the sleigh, so stout and so strong. T is the team that pulls it along. And U are the uses we put our teams to. V is the valley we drive the logs through. W, the woods which we leave every spring. And X, Y, Z, that's all I'm going to sing. Here we go, so merry. So merry, so merry, so merry are we. No mortal on earth is as happy as we. Hi-derry, hi-derry, ho-derry, hi-derry down. Give the shanty boy grub, and nothing goes wrong. Thanks so much.